The University of Alaska Southeast Master of Public Administration program, in partnership with 360 North, presents the UAS MPA Lectures. This evening's presentation, recorded on February 6, 2018, is on sexual harassment in Alaska and how we can go forward. Former State Legislator Beth Kerttula will moderate the discussion with 4 panelists, including 2 state legislators, the University of Alaska's Human Resources Director, and an Alaska Native leader.
Good evening, and welcome to our audience here at the KTOO studio in Juneau, and to our online audience. We'd like to thank the Occoquan for having us on their land for this discussion. This is a very important discussion. My name is Jim Powell. I'm an assistant professor and the program coordinator for the University of Alaska Southeast Master of Public Administration program. Tonight we are continuing the UAS Master of Public Administration lecture series, and I'm proud to present our panel on sexual harassment and the way forward in Alaska. Over the last few months, from Hollywood to our state capital, America has been rocked by reports of sexual harassment. As the press calls it, it's a tsunami of stories of terrible acts, mostly against women. The Me Too movement, the Women's March, and recent resignations from Congress and the State House have all given rise to hope that change, real lasting change, is coming. Tonight we have 4 Alaskan leaders with us to talk about Alaska and how we can move forward. Rather than focus on a particular case, we will be delving into how we as a state and as a culture can change and what path we take. So it's a real honor for me to introduce the panelists here tonight. And it's also, I might add, all women, and I don't see that very often. First, to my far right, Senator Anna McKinnon. She has served the state legislature since 2006, and she is now serving her 4th year as the co-chair of the Senate Finance Committee. Senator McKinnon is a strong advocate for women and public safety and has invested years working on policies and serving committees to prevent domestic violence and sexual harassment. Currently, she is vice chair of the legislature's Sexual and Other Workplace Harassment Working Group, developing a policy to ensure a professional, respectful, and safe environment for everyone. Senator McKinnon has lived most of her life in Alaska and currently lives in Eagle River with her husband. She has 2 sons and a daughter-in-law and 2 grandsons. Next, Representative Ivy Sponholz, a third-generation Alaskan who spent 2 decades working in the nonprofit sector. She describes herself as very passionate about making Alaska a stronger and more vibrant state, where all Alaskans have the opportunity to be all that they can be. She has worked for Abused Women's Aid in Crisis and the Children's Trust, Alaska Children's Trust, as well as UAA and the Salvation Army. She represents an urban district in East Anchorage and is married and has 3 daughters. Next, Ms. Kelly Height McGee. Ms. McGee has been at the university and is the Chief Human Resources Officer and has been there since June 2016. She has more than 20 years of professional experience in communication, human resources, change management, leadership, consulting, and higher education. For many years, Ms. McGee shared the lessons she learned with other professionals in her Sunday business column in the Fairbanks Daily News Miner. Ms. McGee is from a military family, is a graduate of Delta High School, and lived across Alaska for over 25 years, including Nome, Barrow, Delta, Anchorage, and Fairbanks. She is married and has 3 kids. And then from Washington, D.C., we have Nicole Hollingstead, is currently a director of operations at the National Congress of American Indians, born and raised in Petersburg, and has described it as, when she was growing up, shaped by 2 strong grandmothers and a single mother. She is Norwegian and Alaska Native of the Tlingit Nation, and of the Raven and Sea Pigeon Clan. Before her current position, Ms. Halstead worked in Alaska and New York City for private and nonprofit organizations on communications, healthcare, and civic engagement. A former vice president of the Sea Alaska Corporation, has also served as president and board chair for Cancer Connection while she was living here in Juneau. She is married and currently lives in Washington, D.C. And last but not least, the moderator. This is interesting. I can't find my. Okay. I want to get this one right. Anyway, former Representative Beth Kerttula was in the in the State House for 15 years, 7 of those as minority leader, an attorney who was president of the Alaska State Bar. Beth recently served in the Obama White House and director of the National Ocean Council. A third-generation Alaskan, former Representative Kerttula has always been a strong voice for women's rights. She is married and lives in North Douglas. Help me welcome our panelists.
Thank you, Dr. Powell, and for those of you who don't know, Jim and I are married, so it's just particularly funny that he didn't know my resume. So, to have a little fun to begin with. It's great to be here with this wonderful panel, and before we start, I just want to give a few structural comments on how we're going to run tonight. First, we're going to have about a 35-minute discussion, and we've all agreed to go by our first names, and we want this to be a conversation among ourselves about the issue of sexual harassment and how we go forward in Alaska. Then we're going to have about 30 minutes for questions from the audience here and also online. In the audience, if you'll, when I end and we're ready, if you'll line up at the mic so that everyone out in the rest of the world can hear us. And online, you should already be able to see where you'll be able to chat and ask questions at the 360north.org. So questions should be limited. They should be a question, and please don't make them longer than 30 seconds so that we can go on and be able to let the great panelists we have answer. So please keep to the point. And we will not be talking about any specific cases. So please don't ask us about a specific case. The chances are we might get facts wrong. We don't want to focus on that. What we really want to focus on, not that it isn't important, but we don't want to focus on that. What we really have an opportunity to do tonight is to learn from these wonderful, wonderful leaders about what we should be thinking about and how we move forward. So that's what the focus is going to be. So thanks for helping us make this a successful panel, and thank you for being here. I want to mention a couple other quick things, and the first thing is, the definition of sexual harassment tonight is just broad. Everything from an unwanted comment, an unwanted touching, all the way through rape or assault. So when we talk about it, it's with that breadth in mind. There are many definitions, and I don't want us to be too hung up on any particular definition. So with that, panelists, I just want to start with another very broad question, and that is, what do you think we should be doing in Alaska to end sexual harassment and move forward? And I think, Nicole, since I'm sitting close to you, we'll just go down the panel and then we'll continue from there.
Sure.
Thank you.
Well, first, Gunashish, thank you so much for having me here and for having this very important conversation. What comes to mind for me isn't necessarily specific to Alaska, but I do think it will be critical for this conversation going forward, and that is simply the willingness to hear one another with an open mind, because this conversation is big, and the arc of this movement is going to be long, and there will be hot spots and obstacles, there will be resistance, and there will be breakthroughs. But I think the best thing we can do is just really try to understand the perspectives of everybody who is part of this conversation. If we have the kind of conversation we need to have, those participants aren't always going to be like-minded. And so just keeping that open mind as we move forward, I think, is the best that we can do and ask for.
Thanks, Nicole. I agree. I think it's really important that we build a culture of respect, and I think that we do that through awareness. Greater awareness is one of the most significant things that we can do, and also through the opportunity through organizations to really take a hard look and acknowledge what is not working and what mistakes have been made, and figure out a way forward in an open, honest, and transparent way. I think that's going to be really important, and being able to create opportunities for people to feel safe, to speak up, and to ask for assistance and get that assistance with experts around them that care and have compassion.
So, I think there's a lot of answers to this question. I think one of the things that makes this issue such a sticky issue is that there isn't one solution to solving the problem of sexual harassment in our culture. It's really a cultural-wide challenge that we have. But I think there's probably two major things that I'd start with, I guess, for the conversation tonight. And one is that I think that that those of us that feel comfortable doing so should try to lead by example. That when we have opportunities to positively reframe situations that we run into in our lives, that we use that opportunity. And I think, about all of the people that look to each one of us as leaders, whether we be men or women, every day in our lives to step up when the moment arises. And I think, about an example that happened recently in my workplace where some of my colleagues were treated without respect, without the professional respect that they were due. And it was important, I think, for me that we be able to both empower the people that were treated without the appropriate respect and give them an opportunity to identify ways to respond appropriately in the future, but then also to address the person who, intending to give a compliment, to give him a little context about the situation. I think that's a very small kind of thing that each one of us can do in leading by example. But I've also been thinking a lot about the idea of consent. And my oldest daughter goes to Montana State University, where they had a terrible, terrible problem with sexual harassment not that long ago. And they made a commitment as an institution, after I think lawsuits and bigger issues confronted them, to try to really tackle that at all levels. And she told me about her freshman orientation, where they had conversations about consent. And they had deep conversations in mixed gender groups about what consent looked like, about affirmative consent, people needing to continue to provide affirmative consent, and to ask for affirmative consent. And they didn't present this as a one gender or the other. They presented it as, a mutual respect opportunity. And I think it was a great way for these young people to start learning empathy and good communication skills that are going to be necessary to work our way through this big challenge.
Well, building on the other three speakers, it is about respect, but it's also about teaching. And Beth and I had a conversation earlier about how we would respond tonight, and it's going to take all of us. Men right now, during this wave, this tsunami, are really struggling with what is right in the form of a compliment. In the halls of the Capitol, I find men uncomfortable and questioning whether they can compliment someone or not. So it really is a moment in time that we can make a huge difference in allowing men the opportunity to express themselves. And if they're not sure, to be able to ask questions. I know I've been involved in a situation where it could be very easy to embarrass somebody, but my choice was to talk to that person outside of the conversation that I thought was inappropriate and try to teach them and reflect that how they would feel if it was their mother or their daughter or their auntie or someone that they loved inside of that particular situation. And so I took it outside of the boardroom per se and had a conversation with a colleague and a friend to make sure that it starts at the top. And we have to make sure that leaders of organizations as well as legislative bodies, movie theaters, wherever it's at, wherever it's happening now, leaders at the top need to take the time to understand that their actions may or may not be appropriate. And then when we look at the generational divide that Ivy and I and Beth have talked about, that generational divide provides an opportunity, hope, for a huge change in the way we deal with things. So I'll save more of that for later, but it's about respect, and I think that leaders and organizations need to set the tone for what is acceptable and what's not. But we really do need to be kind and respectful as we take those on.
So back to Anna, Senator McKinnon, because I think that you're a very powerful co-chair at this point, and I think that it really is a wonderful thing to see you in that role. But for everyone, do you think that that matters, and how much does that matter, having women in positions of power, and what kind of a message does that send, and do you think that that's important? So I'll go back to you.
Well, first I would say that I come from a group that have male and female, and we're dominated by males. As an elected official I'm trying to think, when I was first elected in 1999, there was about 20% of women represented in all elected positions in America. That number has risen in 2017 to about 25%. So I do think it makes a positive difference, but I just have to say that my colleagues elected me per se to that position. And I earned that spot by being respectful of their opinions and making sure, as Nicole, I believe, said, to make sure that everybody is part of the conversation. So my chairmanship is important in the sense that I listen and respect to everyone, whether they're male or female, and that all voices are allowed to be heard at the Finance Committee table. But I do think women involved in many things offer different perspectives on all issues. And those perspectives are important when we shape good public policy, and they're important in the corporate world because sometimes if you only hear from one perspective, whether it's male, female, whether it's religion, whatever the divide might be that you're meeting, it's an opportunity to learn more about a subject and do something better. So yes, I think it's important that women are there. I feel privileged to have the support of my colleagues in the position that I have in the legislature.
So Ivy, how do we get more women leaders?
Well, I think that leaders like Senator McKinnon actually have really helped, and you have helped plow the fields for a lot of us that have come behind. It's important to me as a woman to see people that look like me in positions of power because it helps me to understand and visualize myself in that position of power. I think it matters a lot. And I think that, those of us that are newer to leadership owe a great debt of gratitude to the women that came before us to help plow that. It was hard work, and I really appreciate it. And I think, a lot about, I want to actually back up and answer the question that you asked Anna earlier, because I think that it is such an important question for me. Having women in those roles helped me to visualize it, but even, seeing women in powerful roles in popular culture has been powerful for me. Seeing Tia Leone played Madam Secretary was something that I didn't even know that I needed until I saw it. And I was like, wow, there's this really amazing woman playing on this international stage, and I know it's fiction, but it was inspiring to me. And I felt the same way when I saw Wonder Woman. And then I think about my daughters. I have 3 teenage daughters, and it's really powerful for them to see role models that they can aspire to. So I think that's an important part of getting more women participating. But, what we know is that there are lots of qualified women that are ready to step into positions of leadership, and what we have to do is sort of, look around and give ourselves a second chance when we're trying to identify potential leaders, whether it's, potential candidates to be a CEO for a corporation, to be board members, to be political candidates. It doesn't really matter. We need to probably maybe give a second glance to people that are around and not just always look to the usual choices, because what we know is if we always look to the usual choices, we'll continue to see the usual outcomes. But when we have more women and minorities and sexual minorities that are at the table of leadership decisions, we actually see better outcomes, whether it's in nonprofits or it's in for-profit companies. And when it's in the political process, there's a lot of research to show that it's true. There's been a lot of leadership and management research that has shown that companies that have diverse boards of directors and diverse leadership are more productive, they are more profitable over the long term. They make better decisions, they're more stable, and they make more money. So we know that diversity actually pays off. But we have to just probably give a double take and not just look to the usual suspects first time around. Give ourselves a little, an extra opportunity to ask ourselves, well, is that person really qualified? Is it time to give, this woman, this minority, this person, this sexual minority the opportunity to step up into leadership? And that's where we're going to see a lot of change.
Kelly, I see the university doing a lot in this area, but
yeah, I would just like to add to that. I mean, one of the things that the university, there's been, the beauty of higher education is you hear of a lot of opinions and you get a lot of input, and I think that's been a really positive thing for the university over the last couple of years. And one of the things most recently is looking at how do we recruit people, and are we teaching? Typically at the university we do, as you probably know, we usually hire by committee, and so it's not one person making that decision. And so one of the things that's really important to do that effectively is to train people how to look at candidates, how to check for implicit bias, and how are we making sure, one of the things we're going to do in human resources, we're just starting, I'm happy to say, is start monitoring how many applications we're getting from a diverse background to make sure that we're attracting people to those jobs so that we do get the most qualified, and we also are open to that need in the organization to increase the diverse backgrounds and perspectives. And another point I guess is just to add on to both of you is I think I have a daughter who's 18 and 2 boys that are just as equally influenced by this, and I think it's very important that they see the capabilities of females in those roles, and that they can do a very good job and have a collaborative approach to problem solving and the way that they do the strategic initiatives of the organization. So I think it's critical that we do that purposefully and mindfully.
Absolutely. And picking up on that, I serve at the National Congress of American Indians in Washington, D.C., and I cannot overstate the importance of having representation in all areas of industry, in entertainment, in the arts. The chance for those little kids to see faces that look like theirs reflected back to them is critical, and we know just through experience and through research now how that helps shape their identity and their expectations for what is possible for them. So that's absolutely part of that is having those representative faces in positions not just of leadership per se, but of influence. There are many different ways of leading in more structured organizations or even within your community. Being willing to have those hard conversations, to raise difficult subjects, to ask important questions is a powerful form of leading as well. And I wanted to swing back to Anna's comment about being able to pay a compliment and how do we sort of move forward in an environment like that. And I was thinking a lot about what the basis of a compliment really is. And I think at heart, when somebody pays you a compliment, what they'd like to do is convey that they see you, that you're being seen and you're being recognized for something in a way that is positive. And I think what's happening now is we're reshaping the language that we use to see one another. So, if we really start to dive into how we talk to each other, how we treat each other, we have to kind of start unpacking how we're portrayed in advertising, in the media, in popular culture. And for the longest time, a sincere compliment about how a woman looked was meant to be empowering or to make them feel better or more beautiful or more desirable. But I think what we have to do now is try to help teach one another that complimenting somebody on a business presentation that went really well, or a speech that was really impactful, or thanking somebody for picking up the kids or for bringing food to a community potluck. The nature of compliments is evolving, and I think it necessarily has to. So if we can encourage people to just think about the basis of what that compliment is and how we'd like to see each other, I think that shift will make a huge difference.
It was literally my next question. I mean, we've been talking about leadership sort of out here, but the next thought it led me to was, what about our language? You know, does our language matter? Do jokes matter? Do compliments matter? And I think Nicole's hit it, but would any of you like to comment on that, about language in general? Kelly?
Absolutely. I think language absolutely matters, and what we say, and being mindful of how we're interacting with other people is very important. And being, we think of the most obvious examples of sort of sexual harassment in language and things like that sometimes, and we forget the more subtle or ways of saying things that sort of have that same impact. And I think teaching people, it's not always their intent, and so teaching people how to communicate in a way that is respectful, and that might not be a good, that might not be taken in the best manner, and keeping awareness at the forefront, I guess. Giving examples of when it works and when it doesn't work. And I think those subtle examples are the ones, just from my background, that we need to teach people more, because the obvious ones are the ones we hear about the most. But there are subtleties to what we say to people and how we say it, and I think that are disrespectful. And we need to figure out a way to educate people to do better with that. So,
yeah, I think words matter a great deal, but as we've described, we're at a moment of transition. We're sort of at a cultural watershed right now. There's something really big happening, and it's uncomfortable for everybody. I've even found myself, questioning myself and checking my own behavior recently, realizing, through a new lens that I'm seeing through now, that I have maybe, implied things that I didn't mean to imply, and I've said things that I didn't mean to say. And that's given me a lot of empathy as I try to understand what it's like for some of my male colleagues to understand the changing world that we're in. And so I guess I want to add to it is I think that we need to be, as we're having these conversations about changing behavior and changing language, that we need to give each other a lot of grace. And we need to allow for the opportunity for people to be vulnerable. There's a lot of men, I think as Anna was, referencing, that don't know what to say right now. They've been following the rules of the road for a long time, and the rules of the road were to give a positive compliment to a woman, you started with their physical appearance. Well, now, when you compliment a woman that is not your partner, or somebody that you're personally close with, and you give them a compliment on their appearance, what you're telling them, without knowing it sometimes, is that that's all that matters, or I don't see you. I don't see you for the intelligent, accomplished professional that you are, or I don't see a lot of other things about you. But in order for men to be able to feel comfortable in learning and understanding what this change needs to be and reframing their perspective, they need to feel okay, sometimes flubbing up and not getting jumped down on. And in a social media, short-term world, sometimes that's hard, and we don't allow people enough grace. But what we all are in this situation still is humans, and humans are imperfect, and humans are going to make mistakes, and even the best intentioned humans are going to make mistakes. And so if we can all try to the very best of our ability to empathize and understand that sometimes when a thoughtless remark comes out of somebody's mouth, or it appears to be thoughtless, if we can try to take a deep breath, give them a moment of grace, and then try to approach it as a learning moment, an educational opportunity, and treat them with the respect that will help them to hear that message, this transition will be a lot easier for all of us.
I agree with everything that's been said. I would just point to that some people may not be thinking about this as deeply as we're talking about it today. And so at least I would go back to my comment about generational. So we have, in the work environment that I'm in right now, 30 and under that I think may think as to the conversation that Ivy just talked about, that they may think beyond and take the time to realize. But we work with a lot of older men. I just turned 60 and I feel blessed to be there. And the men that I've grown up with, I'm not sure that they're thinking that deeply about a compliment. I think that it's ingrained in how they were brought up. They were raised to be polite. And so I do think that we need to extend grace, and I certainly try to extend grace. And I know that I can put people in uncomfortable positions because I might call them out too quickly on something or in front of someone else that might make an awkward situation. So we are at a moment in time that both male and female human beings around the world can make a huge difference in the lives of those coming up. And as a last thought, I read Lean In and brought that to my staff. We actually had a group, a book group that actually looked at Lean In and started to talk about these things about blind studies and whether women can advance or not. And so I think that both sexes have an opportunity, all people have an opportunity to make a difference here. And I think that Ivy hit it on the head. We have to be graceful with each other because not all of us will take the thoughtful approach or can take the thoughtful approach right now that just complimenting somebody on their physical appearance may seem like less than what could happen. Because I know on finance, Beth, I don't want to be thought of as cute. I don't want to be thought of as good looking. I want people to hear the content of the message and the questions that I'm asking, they're important. And I'm not trying to be negative to anyone. I'm trying to reflect questions that my community have asked me, and I am bringing them to the public onto the table where the people can hear about that conversation. And so I want to be known, like most people, for the content of who I am and not what I physically look like.
I saw a program, I started watching lots of TED Talks and on the topic, and it just was almost, it almost hurt to see it last night, that one of the comments was that all women want is a safe place and a place where they can do their work and where they're respected for it. And that was, it's what I hear starting to happen. And you're absolutely right, Anna. You don't want to be at the chair of Senate Finance and to have someone focused on your physical appearance, because that's not what that work is about. Well, we started talking a little bit about men. How do men help? How do men become part of this? Because I agree. I think on the good side of things, there are men who are talking to me, literally friends saying, have I ever done anything? Really starting to think about it. So any good advice?
Well, this will be from our perspective, of course, but this won't move forward without all of us in the conversation. And men will run the spectrum from men who have had similar harassment or abuse experiences, complete allies, understand what's going on and how they can help with language and processes. Men who are good actors, who treat people with respect fundamentally and haven't gotten on the wrong side of that line. To men, and I will say, I've had men in my life who are asking, wow, where is this coming from? And as incredible as that sounds, there will be people on that end of the spectrum who are like, man, this seems like women are really mad right now, and it's kind of hitting them maybe in a way that it hasn't before. Where is this groundswell coming from? What's behind this? And that's where the trying to understand where somebody else is, what their experience is, having some grace about their experience, and be willing to understand that maybe they won't see what the female experience has been, or the experience of people who have been harassed or abused. So there's going to be that whole spectrum, right? But I think this end of the spectrum is where we can gain some really important ground. And part of that is maybe men not fully understanding what either a female or a non-heteronormative or a non-cisgendered experience is. And the hundreds of kind of little microaggressions that those people experience. It's kind of a simple-handed way of putting it, but I was asked this, and so I answered it really honestly. If a woman went through an entire day without hearing about her appearance, or, hey honey, let's have a little smile, or a row, on the street, while that might feel to a certain segment of the population that they're being very mindful and very respectful and that they're really correcting their behavior, for a woman, that would just be a great day. So, helping people close that gap is I think going to be really important.
And I just want to add to it, I think, going back to that is I think it's important for men and women to be together and figuring out the solutions on how we go forward. I mean, that's what our world is. And I'm very pleasantly surprised. We have a task force at the university, and it's men and women, and all are concerned about making it. I mean, this is about equity in the workplace, of everyone having an opportunity to earn a job and to be productive and be respected for the work that they provide to the organization and the contributions they make to the organization. And so it does. I just personally, it impresses me when I'm sitting next to a group of men and women and having this conversation, and we're all passionate about trying to make progress in this area.
I think that that men should be helping each other figure this out. I think that this is a little bit out of, a lot of men's comfort zone, but there are some men that are a lot more comfortable with this, that are a little more woke than others are, and it's an opportunity for them to be leaders. And sometimes it will be younger men helping older men understand things. It's not always going to be that way. I've worked for and with lots of men that helped, inspire me, motivate me, give me opportunities. I have a couple of great dads, like many modern families, and those men all played important roles in my life. But men are a lot of men, I think, are struggling right now with what this means. Do they have to give something up? What does sort of this new world look like? And that can be a fearful place when you fear that you're giving something, that you may have to give up something. That can be kind of a scary place. So I'd say, if men can be helping each other out as we're sort of navigating through this, and try to find ways to help each other understand how this can work. And I've witnessed some great examples recently. There's a gentleman that works in my office who did a really fantastic job last week of helping to educate some other men that we work with about what was appropriate workplace behavior and what wasn't appropriate workplace behavior. And that can only really, that kind of intensity of a conversation is often best coming man to man rather than woman to man, right? There's a natural tension between women and men that sometimes on this issue can be sticky. And so if there's men that are more comfortable with this, it's an opportunity for leadership to help educate other people. And so I think men should be helping each other out.
And I think men are looking for that path. And what we're saying is, go and ask another man. Certainly I'm willing to talk to any of our colleagues about why women want to be treated equally, why they don't feel safe sometimes. And there are specific behavior that some men display more often than not that make women sit at the back of a room or avoid men or avoid them in any situation. And so I think that, the House and the Senate have come together, and we are trying to work in a bipartisan, bicameral way to have an honest conversation about how all people feel in the workplace. Because as I have heard, there are men who are harassed by women. There are women who are bullies. We want to make a professional, safe workplace environment, and that means all of us are in the pool together, and we have to set a few workplace standards. I really don't need to know about your personal life at work. If I want to go out for a drink or have lunch with you and you want to share personal things, that's fine. But in the workplace, Now we're really trying to get things done. We're in session for, we hope, 90 days. And you know, my team is working really hard all of the time to, and I know others teams are working really hard all of the time just to get the work done. And so the distraction is hard, but it's an awkward time, like we've all said. And transition is good, right? Because that means there's growth. So not being so comfortable means we have an opportunity to move forward, and we need to move forward together.
So we've been talking about language, how do we work with men, how do men learn, how do they help each other, but I want to go to maybe the darker place. I was pretty shocked after many celebrities started coming forward. I don't want to talk about the case, but I want to talk about just the sense of this is a worse problem maybe than I even thought it was. And Alaska has terrible statistics, as we all know. For Native Alaskan women, shockingly, almost 10% more likely to be assaulted than white women. And I want to turn to, how do we work with people who have been harassed, been assaulted? How do we change the process? One thing I've seen happening right now that I think is a really good step forward is that I think people are being believed, maybe for the first time. As a public defender, as a very young lawyer, it was shocking to me how the victims were not believed. And I think that might be changing. So I just want to turn to you on the harder side of things. What kinds of things do you think should be instituted? If it's a policy, if it's how do we do a better job of working with people who have been assaulted? How do we work with rural Alaska? And just, I'll start with you again, Nicole.
Well,
And that's a broad one, I'm sorry.
No. I mean, you know, these conversations are going to range from the broad down to the very specific. And, you know, Native American women in particular, 30% of them will experience some form of violence or sexually based harassment in their life. But what I think is also important to convey is that among the Native American population, 88% of those perpetrators are non-Native. So particularly in the lower 48, there is that sort of jurisdictional issue about who is committing these crimes. Within the state of Alaska, you know, hit the nail on the head. The statistics are really unbalanced, and so, you know, we have to work to understand what's helping drive some of those behaviors. And that's where having that full conversation about what are some of the motivators behind the behavior that creates either harassment or violence. And what I'd like to point out right now is we've been talking a lot about men, and I appreciate your point that there are women abusers, there are women bullies, there are women harassers. Fundamentally, harassment is not necessarily about a sexual overture. It really is an abuse of power. And that power dynamic between the abuser and the abused, the harasser and the harassed, that's where we really have to dive into the heart of that. And power isn't necessarily leadership power, you know, positional power, traditional power. It can be power over the food on the table, the roof over your head, the power over whether your children will be the subject of this violence instead of you. And that abuse of power has been much more prevalent among men, which we're finding, you know, Hollywood, and then of course, you know, that has moved on to Washington, D.C., and so we've seen those people having their voice and having this opportunity finally to tell their story and be believed. But when you start looking at women who can abuse that power as well, that often can become a shield or an enabler or a protector for men who are abusing their power. And we need to be mindful and watchful of that too.
If I could jump in.
Yeah.
So I totally believe it's power. And, you know, we all have the opportunity to do good for other people, and we have the opportunity to abuse power. And, you know, I have watched both in action in different jobs and different employment. And what it takes is a group of people coming together who are brave. And we've watched that in Hollywood, where people have exposed their hearts as well as their careers and their future careers possibly to say and identify and point out what's wrong and who's wrong. And I think the same thing goes for the power. Some people abuse power, and people that are next to them need to make sure that that abuse stops. It needs to be called out and called for what it is, and we have to stand up together to say it. If you go to specific statistics on sexual assault and rape in our state, when I was the executive director of Standing Together Against Rape, you were, if you were an Alaska female, you were 2 point something, and I think it was over 2.5% more likely to be raped in Alaska during your life than any other state in the union. Horrible statistics, appalling, scary for young women these days. We have to stop that, but when you think about rape and you think about the definitions that are underlying some of these issues, some people don't think rape is rape. And I've just got to tell you, sitting in a hospital room for almost 24 hours, because when I got called, that meant there were 3 rapes in front of me, because I was the 4th layer of backup for Standing Together Against Rape. That means an emergency call at night, and we would wait. And when you look at the definition and you look at the victims, you understand the hurt and the harm that has happened. After I was the executive director of Standing Together Against Rape, I was the development director for Hospice of Anchorage. From people who are losing their life with life-limiting illness to those who had lost their life because of a sexual act. It's horrific, but the people who are committing those crimes, they objectify. You know, you talked about language. Women's bodies have been taken apart, as well as nice-looking men's bodies now, and objectified in our news, in advertising everywhere. And it really upsets me as the mother of 2 boys to see what is done in video games these days, and how often video games have people dying or being raped or bad things, and then they turn it off and it all pops up and it repopulates and they restart the game. What are we telling young people? They do not have a clear understanding of what reality is anymore in some cases. Mental illness is a huge issue both in Alaska, in our correctional systems, and across America. We are inundating people with inappropriate imagery and objectifying women to some degree more than men are objectified, and we've taken people apart and we've compartmentalized them. And I think that we have to have a conversation about a whole person. And what is really happening, it is not sex when you rape somebody. It is devastation. It is close to murder. It is destroying someone's spirit. And people who are involved in that have to be held accountable to actually understand what they have done in trauma to another person. And if you can't tell, I'm passionate about it.
Thank you. Kelly?
I just, so I think one of the other ways to impact this in this conversation, and I really appreciate what everybody here is saying, is have a place where there are resources, and even in organizations, I think we think that the resources there are only for employees and the events that happen at the workplace, when in fact we can build and be leaders in the organization, but also connect if something happens personally or has happened before, where they've never been provided resources and the advocacy and a compassionate person such as yourself to help them through that process and never had the chance to heal. And we have an opportunity through our policies, setting policies that say we are all responsible. If we hear of something that has happened to someone, we have a responsibility to report that so that they can get the resources that they need and deserve, and connect that and working with our community, not in isolation of our organization, but a community where we bring that awareness, an opportunity to educate in organizations where they're not as big and don't have the resources to build that awareness and advise on training. Training is not one and done. It's a constant conversation about, as we evolve and as we learn more about sexual harassment and what that looks like and what is and is not okay. And I know we want to be respectful of those that are trying to do the right thing, and we also need to hold people accountable that are not trying to do the right thing and are sexually harassing their colleagues. So those are the things that we can do with a more honest and awkward, but honest conversation about how we do this in an educated and a compassionate way.
So I want to try to punctuate this because I think that you all have very ably described some of the very real and deep challenges that we have, as well as some of the things that we need to do. I think that we have a real opportunity right now, given that we have more women in positions of influence than we've ever had before. We have an opportunity to reshape the discussion, and I think that's part of what's happening right now at this cultural moment, is that there has been moments, brief flickers in the past where we uncovered sexual harassment or sexual assault, epidemics within institutions, within organizations, within communities that we weren't able to gain traction on over the long run. And a lot of people have asked me, what is different now? And I think what is different now is that women are in the discussions about how to respond to these things in ways that we weren't 30 or 40 years ago. There are more women that are a part of editorial boards, there are more women that are a part of HR departments, that are part of, leadership in, political organizations in all places. And that's not enough, but what it is an opportunity for us to shine our light and our experience onto that. There's been a lot of research that shows that 30% is sort of a magic number. There's a national organization that has a 30% in its name, and I can't remember it right now, but they advocate for trying to have, all organizations have 30% of women and minorities in their leadership in all different kinds of organizations, because the research has shown that once you get to 30%, you get past the point of being marginalized. And I think about, editorial rooms, 30 years ago where there might have been one woman in the room, and one woman is a lonely, lonely voice when talking about how it is to respond or how to cover sexual harassment or sexual assault. But when you have 2 women or 3 women, they can start to amplify one another. They can start to support one another. They can validate each other's experience, and I think that is part of what's happening right now. So if we can use this opportunity to be, as people that are a part of the conversation that have all experienced sexual harassment or sexual assault, and I don't know a lot of women that haven't experienced that, to try to find ways to make sure that we cement this moment and we dig into it and we keep pushing forward and we make change this time in ways that we haven't in the past. I think that's a real opportunity.
And speaking of statistics, I don't think we'll be surprised if we find that these statistics will actually spike up. Because what's happening now is women are telling their stories, they are being believed. When you report, there's action that wasn't there before. And so I think we will see, whether it will be actual incidences or just women coming forward or men who've had these experiences and just reporting on it. I think we need to be prepared for that to happen, and how we work through that and keep moving towards the goal. And
we do. We see that at the university. We see an increase. They're not all, but because we're doing a good job of trying to put people in place and communicating those resources so people can come forward on what is occurring for them, it helps them to have resources. I mean, it's kind of like having a complaint department, but you have nowhere to put it, and so it goes into the suggestion box in the organization. If you don't have personnel and resources in it that are being trained and being developed in a way that they understand that, then those complaints go nowhere. And so I think we're learning, and we have more to learn and more to do to make that change. But I think getting people to the right place and the right resource on all sides is very important.
I'm going to turn to questions in just a minute. I was going to ask one last question before we go, the panel, before we do that, and that is, do you think that the younger generations are going to make a difference in this? And millennials in particular. What do you think is happening generationally? And we can just quickly go down. I know Ivy and Anna and I have already talked about it, so I know what they're going to say, but Nicole,
absolutely. There's no question. The way that our youth communicate with one another, what they've seen as group solutions, whether it's through social media campaigns or Kickstarter or GoFundMe or anything that brings them together around a solution, that requires communication, it requires openness, it requires them talking about what's actually going on. And so I think this sort of oppressive culture of silence that women have been under, or people who've been abused have been under for a very long time, I think that's cracking wide open. And the way our youth just move through the world, I think will set that standard for this not being allowable anymore.
And away from shame.
Away from shame, exactly.
Kelly?
I would say absolutely. I mean, just even with my own children, and then again in the university where you have the opportunity in higher education where they're educating more and more. That is the younger generation coming up and helping them to set new expectations. I think is our role.
I think absolutely. I think that the conversations that I have with my children about consent, about choice, about interactions between genders they're so different than the conversations that I was having with my parents 20 years, and it's pretty it's very, very exciting. And the young people that work in my office, the language that I hear from them, the empowerment and the mutual respect that I see in them working with each other is very exciting. And so, I look to them sort of as my inspiration a lot when we're trying to figure out how to work through some of the tough issues that we have, trying to bring, others along with us. It's nice to be able to look at my millennial colleagues for inspiration, because it gives me hope that we will be able to make the kind of change that I aspire to.
So we have some poor statistics that may have led up to this, and I would point to many kids today were raised by single moms in particular. I know that there are a lot of single dads out there too, so I don't want to not give credit where credit is due, but because families have changed over the course of several decades, I think children, the millennials, have gotten a little bit more wide open experience than maybe I got when I was younger. I think I was protected, sheltered. My mom stayed home with me the whole time. My dad went to work. So I think that the role models are different because of that family dynamic change, and we do have great hope with our children that they are truly colorblind. They are ready to take on the world. They want equity, they want equality, they want to have all that we have and more. And so I think that they will push us, whether we don't continue this conversation. I think the millennials that are on the ground already are opening up doors for those of us who are a bit older to see the inequity that we have lived with for a while. And I really appreciate Ivy, pointing to other women, and I would point to women before me, like Beth, who opened doors for me, or other Arlis Jadlewski, Fran Ulmer, you name it. We're all part of the great history of Alaska in opening doors, and I think the millennials will help us keep the doors open on this particular conversation.
So we are going, and with hope. I mean, it's a wonderful message. I mean, and you've all, echoed it, and that has given me a lot of hope in the future. So we're going to go to questions, and we have some from online, but here in the audience, if you'd like to have the mic, we'd love to have a question or two. We've got about 30 minutes left in the whole conversation, and we'll be happy to keep talking, but if you have a question, and you go to the mic, we can get you. This question is from Fairbanks, and the question is, what efforts are happening to expand resources to address this problem in rural Alaska? So the problem of, let's go, harassment, domestic violence, and we can, and I'll go to you first. And
Yeah,
it's
sure. This
limited resources in our state at this point. It's a difficult, not an easy question.
Right. It is and it isn't. Alaska, as you know, is facing a 6th year of drawing just from our savings accounts. We're $2.5 billion short to sustain the current budget. That's sort of the bad news story. The good news is we do have some diversification of assets that we're trying to put into effect, and we have different opinions on doing that. But speaking specifically to rural Alaska and Commissioner Davidson, as far as Indian Health Services, Commissioner Davidson has went after a waiver at the federal government to allow Alaska Native or American Indians to actually enter the Medicaid system. And she is also looking from a public health perspective at other initiatives that will try to help harness federal resources as well as state resources to match and deploy on behavioral health issues, which are just extreme for many Alaskans. And so we are trying to deploy more resources. Governor Walker has proposed spending more money on public safety and allocating some of those resources into rural Alaska, but it is a challenge. When I was the executive director of STAR, we would get calls. We had a 24-hour crisis line, and we would get calls from communities way outside of the rail belt that were looking for help and resources to come in. And sometimes it's only a landline that's available for that particular person or instance, but we are working together to, how I describe it, braid resources together, both from the nonprofit world, places like the Rasmussen Foundation that have reached out to other large foundations across America, across the United States, or even globally, to bring those resources to bear in Alaska. Corporate America is lending their shoulder and their resources to try to help deploy good initiatives, and they're coming to the state government to be part of that braid to strengthen the funding sources that are going out there. But at this time, our ability to help is limited by our ability to solve Alaska's fiscal problems.
Great comment, though. I know that some of the corporations that work in rural Alaska are doing quite a bit in terms of social issues, and maybe they can do even more. Nicole, and then Ivy, can I do that?
I was going to say, even on the national level, NCAI, we work for good policy for tribes across the United States, and there are 229, recognized tribes just within the state of Alaska. The Victims of Crime Act created a fund that helps funnel money to areas where it's needed, and we're working on policy where there's a 5% tribal set aside, and that doesn't exist now, and that would help channel some resources into the state of Alaska as well for those tribes to deal with this.
Great.
So this isn't a question specifically about resources, but it is about sort of looking at the challenges and the opportunities, particularly in rural and tribal Alaska in particular. And there is a lot of amazing work that's being done right now in tribal self-determination. And there are tribes throughout the state of Alaska that are looking at how to deal with challenges like intergenerational trauma, which help to drive a lot of the kinds of behavior that we're talking about today. We have communities where there's been really serious trauma, and that can sort of turn into a vicious cycle after time. But there are creative people that are looking at this. There's a group called the Alaska Resilience Initiative, which is bringing together people that are trying to identify proactive ways to deal with trauma and to create more resilience in our communities throughout the state of Alaska. And they're working, I think one of the co-chairs of that group is the leader of the Chicaloon tribe. So that's a great example of tribal leadership coming together, and there's that initiative is a statewide coalition, and they're bringing together folks that are cross-sector, much like Anna was saying. It's nonprofits and tribes and governmental agencies and academic experts all coming together to try to identify ways that we can heal the intergenerational trauma that has really been plaguing a lot of our communities, and allow for the kind of healing that's going to help us to get where we need to go over the long term. It's very exciting.
Kelly, would you like to comment?
I think, we do this through our organizations as well, and I think it's how we contribute is through learning, teaching others and setting up the best practices and leading in that, and how we address people in rural community as well, but also throughout Alaska. It's having compassion, it's having people they can talk to, and it's having experts that know where to go to get the resources. But I would love to see the state of Alaska and the work that you're doing to create more resources for that, because it does take resources to really have a bigger impact. So
I know that UAS in their MPA, their Masters of Public Administration program, is starting to have a focus on governance, on tribal governance, and that kind of focus and looking out and having more people educated. I think, great step. Thank you for being so patient. Here in the audience, we have our first question. Thank you.
I am stuck a little bit on the comment about grace, about having grace in this discussion. And while, of course, I may wish that I was a more graceful person, I'm worried a little bit about the idea of grace competing with accountability. And I feel like that's kind of what got us where we are. And so, at the end of this conversation, I feel like we've gotten more toward the point, which is, how do you work in a collegiate environment, or a co-worker first, teamwork first environment, and call out power plays at the same time? Because I think that's really what we're talking about, and that feels to me like slightly different from grace, and I wonder if you have any more comments on that.
Well, since I started the topic of grace, I'll jump in. Grace does not preclude accountability. And I think that's a really important topic. But what we also can't have is a situation where we have folks playing whack-a-mole, going after somebody who makes an uncouth comment, and not embracing that opportunity for what it is, which is a real opportunity to make change. Now, when I talk to the person who makes an inappropriate comment, and I'm trying to be graceful about it and to give them a moment of grace, I'm not trying to let them off the hook, but what I am trying to do is to preserve their dignity so that they can keep their ears open. Because what I know is that when I get really mad and I feel like I'm being attacked, sometimes I have a tendency to shut down. That's a very natural human tendency. That's not unique to Ivy Sponholz. That is a human tendency, right? And so if I want the kind of deep change to really happen, I have to be willing to stick through that conversation, and that involves a little grace. It does not allow enabling or letting people off the hook. And I think that's what you're getting at. And I wouldn't suggest that we should let people off the hook. And that's a tough thing. But what I know is that I have a sense that if we move towards the heat in the conversation, but because that's where the real change is going to happen. I think you mentioned heat earlier, that when you get into conflict, there's a little bit of heat there. I want to stick in that conversation, and I want to keep in that conversation through to completion. And that doesn't happen if the other person says, you know what, you're not listening to me, screw you. Then I'm not having that change moment. And so what I want to do is I want to try to approach them with enough grace so that I can treat them with respect and they can hear me, so we can have a full conversation and get to the other end. Now, if once I've extended that grace, somebody continues to behave badly, that's when we get into accountability. And there has to be both accountability and transparency in some of that accountability in order to have change happen over the long term. I was listening to the news this morning. We were talking about this a little bit in the green room earlier. The House of Representatives voted in favor of their new sexual harassment policy at the federal level. And one of the things that it requires is that there be transparency in terms of findings of sexual harassment claims and by legislators, which in the past wasn't the case. And it requires that legislators pay for it out of their own pocket, which seems, instead of using their office accounts, which seems pretty obvious to the rest of us, right? That we should all be accountable for our own behavior. But that's what accountability looks like. But I don't want to turn people off before I even have the conversation with them. If we do that, then we're just going to continue to stay in this place of culture war where we don't get to resolution.
And I would just like to add that I think it's teaching people that we're all responsible to make it a positive environment. Period. And that means inappropriate doesn't belong. You know, inappropriate conversations, inappropriate comments don't belong. And I think as we teach more and more that we're all responsible for that, I think we can say it in a way that is a learning, teaching moment, and we should never pass up the opportunity. People don't know how to do that, I guess is what and so I think we have to set that expectation. You know, I will jokingly say HR's in the house when the conversation sort of starts to go sideways, and it's not to say don't do this while I'm here. This is to say, yeah, no, that's not, we're not going down that path here ever. So in a fun but serious way, if you can have that comment. I can smile and be really serious, maybe that's my gift. But
well, I think the very heart of this particular panel is where do we go from here? And what we're seeing now is a very brightly burning flame. This is people who are, you know, and every story and every example is a little bit of kindling on that flame, and you know, it feels like it's burning really hot right now. But the question for us is, how do we convert that from that really hot heat into sustainable energy? You know, sound like I'm right, but it's like it's a different fundamental law of physics, right? For that to be sustainable, we have to be able to convert it into something that draws people to it instead of pulling away. And we certainly don't want to stay in a place where it feels like the victims have to come up with a solution, right? So how do we get everybody into this conversation and allowing for some grace and allowing for some more understanding? This fire, it has to burn hot. People have to be able to pour their stories and their anger and their hurt and their frustration into that flame. But ideally, we can burn that off and start working on those real structural solutions.
And I know you had a...
Oh, I agree with everything that's been said. I think that people have to be held accountable. I think we have to call people out, and it's how we call them out for that behavior. If it rises to the level that it should be, that it's a violation, then it needs to be submitted to personnel and go forward. But you still can have grace with someone who's behaved inappropriately, to try to teach them, to take that moment to tell them how it might be more appropriate for them to respond. I've said it before, I don't need those sexual comments or jokes in the workplace. What I need is to solve Alaska's problems right now, and we need to make sure that people are held accountable, and that's why we are trying to adopt a policy and have our staff actually review it so that there is meaningful change, so that fire keeps on burning, and that so people feel like they'll be heard on all these issues. But I appreciate the question, because we don't want Alaskans to walk away that might not have the opportunity to ask the question at the microphone today, to think grace somehow means not being accountable, because we have to hold all people accountable, and we have to be accountable with how we're engaging in that real conversation.
I'm going to break my rule and make one comment about this, because I think it's important for people my age, just a little older than Anna and on in particular, and that is you sometimes give up something of yourself if you don't get to use that grace. And I don't mean to be obtuse, but there's something about, I don't want to have to be overly angry. I don't want to have to be overly confrontational when I approach it. I want to maintain who I am and not lose that. It's almost a power situation. So it's another part of it, I think, for me at least, is that I want to be able to hang on to who I am and what my comfort level is when I deal with it.
And I want to build on that. I want to hang on to that relationship, because you know, so we're politicians, we deal in relationships, but I think we're social beings and we all deal in relationships. And not every person in my personal sphere shares all of my values, but I have to be able to have that conversation. And sometimes having conversations with people that fundamentally disagree with me involves a little bit of grace, a little bit of empathy, so that we could try to get to a place that we need to go. You know, when I'm talking to my father-in-law, who is a much more conservative man than I am, I have to try to hear him as much as I ask him to hear me in order to get to a resolution. And if I can't try to meet him, not let him off the hook for behavior that doesn't meet today's standards, but try to understand where he's coming from, I can't help him understand where I'm coming from. And I think that's how it is that we resolve problems in a really complex society. And sometimes it involves, having conversations that are intense with people that we really disagree with, and that involves a lot of empathy. And it's hard work, but that's where the big change happens.
Laurie?
Beth, you opened this evening with talking about multiple approaches or multiple solutions to moving forward. And I would like maybe for you all to speak a little bit more of the role and power that policy can play in these solutions.
Great. Well, it's very complex. Beth alluded to it right at the start. We're going to have a conversation that's very wide, and you can interpret whatever we're saying to lay across a wide variety of situations. We're struggling right now just with the Alaska human rights law and reporting inside of 180 days. So that's the bar for what is legally required. And so beyond that, the legislature has never had sort of a civility policy, and we really don't want a civility policy. It seems so formal. What I want, and we'll see if others agree with it, is a professional workplace environment where people are respected and feel safe. And so one area that we're working on now is policy. The other, from both, I would guess, from both Ivy and I's position, is talking with people who are uncomfortable right now. People are on a journey. Most of those people on that journey are men, which is why a little bit of grace, because they're not saying the right things. I still get stopped in the hall and asked whether they can compliment my hair. I have a much different way to respond, even just after participating today and talking to them about how about the content of a conversation or a debate, and raising that level. So I think it's happening all over. I truly believe that men are part of the solution. They're part of the problem too. Women are part of the problem. I think we just need to be honest, and for those that have done something wrong, they need to be held accountable. But we also need a way, just like in our correction system, for people to recover, for people to find a way to be better people, to engage in relationships and conversations that are a higher level.
I knew this would happen. We've got 9 minutes left. If anyone would like to answer specifically, we'll try to take one last question and then close up.
I
Kelly?
would love to answer the policy, and obviously I'm coming from an organizational perspective, but I definitely appreciate the state of Alaska making this a priority. Policy to me, I mean, communication. So we say communication is that we have shared understanding of what that message is and what we expect. And so policy plays the role of clarifying our shared understanding of what we can expect in the way that what is okay, what is not okay, how we're going to handle it, how we're going to address it. And so it's institutional memory. And so we get new people in and they're not sure, and so that's when we start to waver on what we have said and agreed upon were the best practices. So while I don't want to wrap everything around a policy, because I think we have to, again, I cannot emphasize enough, make people more aware. And we do that, but there is a place for policy, and I do believe of its importance. So thank you for the question.
Nicole?
Well, I was going to say there's policy small, not small, but in the sense of the procedures and structures that we've agreed to within organizations to follow. Now, policy, we've all been places where there's a policy and it's on the wall, and it might be in your manual, but if the behavior doesn't conform to it and people aren't brave enough to call it out and enforce it and follow through with what's in place, then we falter. And that's what we're seeing with a lot of places. And then there's policy writ large about what is our policy to help people be heard and be seen. One very specific thing we could do is address the backlog of rape kits we have in our hospitals. Help those victims be seen and be heard and get closure, and in some cases get justice. So, there's a couple of ways we can approach that policy question.
Great. I don't know that I have a lot left to add. I mean, I think, policy is pretty complex. There's a lot of opportunities, and there's a lot of places where we need to try to sort of cement in the changes that we're discussing right now and the new sort of sets of shared norms that we were agreeing to now in this modern moment. In the legislature, we saw that we had a sexual harassment policy, but it didn't work very well, right? It was sort of toothless, and it didn't have the impact of creating the kind of culture where people felt respected and that they could work in a professional environment. And so, policy matters on every level, and I think, there's been great examples of how policy applies at every level as well.
One last question.
Hi, I just want to, first of all, thank all of you for being here and being in the positions you're in, because I think you're right. Having women at the table is absolutely necessary for the change to happen. I think your 30% number is low. I think 50% is probably low.
You're a millennial?
But yeah, I definitely want to thank you for being here and having the conversation. I think your comments about grace are very kind. I think they're important for keeping men at the table, and I think as a man, we can afford a little bit less grace. I think that you guys have succeeded, and the other professional women around this room have succeeded through strength and perseverance, and despite a lack of grace on the other side. But I, as a man, I appreciate it. I definitely appreciate your grace. I guess I would ask, so with policy being one of the ways in which we can make a change, and you women and the women around me being an example for younger folks being a way we can make a change, it would seem to me that holding men accountable, and that specifically education is maybe the next big step. And while at 45, I like to think I'm not a lost cause. I would like to see possibly education about equity and consent and opportunity be part of the educational curriculum at a high school level, or a junior high level. I mean, I think this is a conversation that has to be part of health. I think it has to be part of civics and social studies. I think this is something that we're not going to see a 50% number or a 70% number. God be praised, that'd be great. But we're not going to see it without that. Do you guys have ways in which you can incorporate that?
Thank you. Thank you. And so we have a minute each for all of
I'll
you
just
to
say
get to.
I'll be really brief, but I think it requires people living by example and taking a stand. And I really appreciate your comments. So I really think it belongs to leadership, and that there is structure in there, and that there's support, HR, but also in leadership and things like that help to remind us, yes, these are our standards, and yes, we are going to live by them, and yes, there are consequences if we don't. We'll set you up for success, we'll train you, we'll teach you so that you understand what those expectations are, and we will also make sure that is how we live by example.
We've got about 3.5 minutes left, so I'm going to thank all of you right now for being here. It was really, I've worked with Anna for a long time, but with all of you, it was just really, you inspire me and give me hope yourselves. But I want to give you the last word, so I think you can watch when that's at nothing, but you've got about 45 seconds, and we'll just go down the line. Nicole?
Well, part of involving everybody and keeping sort of our open ears and our open hearts about this is paying attention to what we're teaching our kids, whether it is advertising, culture, the sort of bro-hem society about sex as conquest or bragging rights, and women who have been taught for thousands of years to be accommodating and to compromise and to give less of themselves because they'll be pushed back if they don't. Keep your ears and your hearts open and be the best example that you can be.
I would just say, I think for us to be really credible that we want to see change, we have to sincerely want change. That has to be our intent, and we have to improve our capabilities to ensure that that's happening and that people know that. And then ultimately, our results need to be better. We need to be, our responses need to be better, our actions need to be better, and I think that's where we're going, and I just am so thankful to be a part of this conversation.
30% wasn't my number. That was somebody else's number that I quoted. I think that 50% is where we need to land, and that I actually believe it will happen. I think it's just a matter of time. And the closer we get to that time, the closer we're going to get to seeing the kinds of equity that are really important. I'm excited right now at how entrenched this conversation has become. You know, the last times that we heard, you know, that we've felt cultural blips out there, and I'm going to call them that for now because hindsight is 20/20. We weren't able to make that kind of deep change, and I'm feeling a depth of conversation and a depth of action that we haven't felt before, and I'm very excited about it, and I'm excited that the conversation will continue.
So I would just add, first, thank you all for coming today. For those who are watching, we greatly appreciate you taking time out of your evening or morning, depending on when this might air, you might watch it. But I have always believed that together we can make a difference. It's how I sign most of the letters that I sign. It is within your grasp to provide a good day for anyone just by connecting eye to eye and hearing, as Nicole said, by listening, as I believe Kelly said, by reporting, by holding people accountable, whether it's through grace, that you report someone and then try to help them be a better man or a better woman in how they deal with people. It's about power, and you have it.
On time. Thank you.
That was Beth Kerttula moderating a discussion on sexual harassment and the way forward in Alaska. This program was produced by the UAS Master of Public Administration program in partnership with 360 North. It was recorded live at 360 on February 6, 2018, and can be watched on demand at 360north.org.